All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to the finals of the 2022 hockey advocacy competition. So we're delighted to be here after a number of really impressive rounds of competition between high school students from across Canada. So here we have our finals for today. So we have two arbitrators. So we have Garrett Yao and Ben Buckler, who are here to arbitrate this competition, both who have a lot of experience with hockey arbitration and bring such a wealth of experience to the competition. So for our competitors, we have Team A, so Anna Sophia and Sebastian, who are here on behalf of the player Adam Pelech. And then on the other hand, on behalf of the club, we have Annie Wu and Joanna Dong. So we're very excited to have everybody compete. So I'll turn it over to the arbitrators and they can get started whenever they're ready.
Sounds good. I think I've had a chance to meet everybody just to go through the introductions because I know that Matt is recording this. My name is Garrett Yao. I go to the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. I'm in my third year and I had a chance to work for the NHL Players Association 2 years ago. I had a chance to work on a lot of these cases and deal with a lot of these comps. I've also had a chance to work in baseball arbitration, so very well versed in the space. We have Ben here. Ben, you want to do a quick introduction about yourself as well?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ben Buckler. I'm a graduate of U of T Law and Rotman's MBA as of last year. I'm currently articling at Stikeman Elliott. I am not doing anything arbitration related right now. But I am very experienced in both winning and losing this competition, having lost the internal U of T competition, lost the Canada-wide competition, and won the U of T competition and won the Canada-wide competition. So like I said last time, you learn a lot from losing. So no matter what happens, I've been very impressed and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens as well with you guys.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. And both teams know how the scoring rule, the timing rules go. 14 minutes per side. Player side will go first, then 3 minutes for rebuttal for each side. Ben and I will probably interject at multiple points to ask some questions. If there are no further questions, then we are ready to go. Player side, whenever you're ready, you may begin.
All right, thank you, Mr. Arbitrators. You've both met me, but for the recording, my name is Ana Sofia Flores and my colleague's name is Sebastian Boley. We represent the player in this case, and we submit that Mr. Pelech, the player, his salary for the 2021-22 season should be $4.1 million given the following considerations. 1, Pelech is a consistent and very trusted member of his team who's good at what he does. And 2, when compared to similar players, Pelech is superior in consistency, oftentimes experience, and very often durability. Sometimes he even outperforms other players in what they're supposed to do better. Now, to support this request of a salary of an average annual value of $4.1 million, I'll briefly discuss Mr. Pelech's commendable NHL career, key themes that support his merit as a player, and context regarding his platform year. Then I'll describe how we picked our comparable players and what metrics we used to analyze them. And then lastly, my co-counsel will discuss the two comparable players in depth. Just briefly, I would note that we've met both of you and both of you have seen our player submission and you both have different preferences regarding how we speak about the comparable players. So we're going to try to give you all of it, keeping the time in mind. One of you wants us to go year by year with specific stats. The other one wants us to do a summary. We'll try to please both of you. Now, to briefly go into Mr. Pelech's individual merits, Mr. Pelech is what we call a defensive defenseman or a stay-at-home defenseman. He specialized in a particularly strong defensive game, and that means his strength is in guarding his team's end of the ice, preventing opposing players from getting shots in, and playing in what we call a shorthanded or penalty kill situation. Now, a team needs a mix of players and a mix of defensemen. Defensive defensemen are crucial to a team because they neutralize the specialized offense players on the opposing team. Now, as part of their team's top 2 defensemen, they're usually paired with a two-way or offensive defenseman, but that type of pairing shows that the individual importance of each player in that pairing is significant. Mr. Pelech has played 6 seasons with the New York Islanders. He's experienced with 303 games under his belt between 2015 and 2021. And throughout his career, he's proven he's good in his defense-minded role. He has great endurance and stamina. He's consistent, and Mr. Pelech's durability is never in question. Even when he was injured, he was getting put on the ice more and more. It's clear that he's earned the trust of his team and coach. He has an above average time on ice, often above 19 or 20 minutes, and he's typically on the ice for about 45% of any given shorthanded situation. And all of his statistics were on the rise and steadily increasing a bit until COVID hit. And he, like many other players in this platform year, who have platform years in 2020 and 2021, had a hard time readjusting. Now, the pandemic limited players' abilities to train consistently, join practices. It was a weird year. It was a throwaway. And of course, with less training, they underperformed. Mr. Pelech stayed pretty steady overall. Some of his statistics slightly improved, mostly offensive statistics. He saw slight rises in his points per games played and power play time on ice. But he basically played like Adam Pelech usually plays. He remained consistent, sturdy, and that's valuable to a team. Pelech also took minimal damage to his defensive statistics when compared to other players with platform years in 2020 and 2021. Whereas players of his statures were off the ice and playing less games, he still played 56 games, and his time on ice and shorthanded time on ice stayed pretty consistent. And so despite this universal blip of COVID, we still know what we're going to get when we put Adam Pelech on the ice. He's remained durable, consistent, trusted, and good at what he does. On a team like the New York Islanders, which is very successful and known for their defense, Mr. Pelech remains an integral part of this. Now, briefly, I'd like to outline the comparable players we've chosen, but more specifically, why we've chosen them and also what metrics we're using to analyze them. Now, our priority when picking these players was to ensure that you as arbitrators could see how multiple players with key similarities might outperform or underperform when compared to one another. And in this case, the most important similarities for us are that the players we chose were also specialized defensemen. So that's it. That is, they're not two-way, but rather offensive or defensive. And basically what we're doing here is we're trying to make sure that you're not comparing apples and oranges, which is unnecessarily difficult. We also wanted to make sure that the players were roughly the same age as Mr. Pelech, who is 27 years old, and that the players' contracts were signed more recently, meaning in 2020 or 2021. Based on these metrics, the eligible contenders are Brandon Carlo, who is a defensive defenseman for the Boston Bruins and the only defensive defenseman other than Mr. Pelech in this case, and then also Matt Grzelski, an offensive defenseman for the Boston Bruins. Now, for all players, we submit to you that the most important statistic is their time on ice, and you may be wondering, well, why is that? Time on ice is fairly subjective. The reason why we submit this to you is that in this tournament, we don't have access to the wealth of materials that can indicate a player's overall merit in their individual and specialized position. So we don't have statistics to measure a player's defensive awareness, passing abilities, balance, agility, acceleration, stick checking abilities. All of these different statistics, the long and short of it is that we're lacking them in this tournament. And so time on ice clues us in on how much a coach both trusts and values the player for their role, and also how integral they are to their team's success, given those myriad of other statistics that we simply can't reference specifically. For defensive defensemen, we place highest importance on their shorthanded time on ice per games played. We also see value in their plus minus, as that's typically indicative of how efficient a stay-at-home defenseman is, as well as their blocks and takes. For offensive defensemen, who are more aggressive in their plays by nature and by the nature of their role, we place most importance on their power play time on ice, hits, and points, as well as any other offensive statistics. But again, hits, points, and takes are not the best metric we would respectfully submit to you for a defensive defenseman's success, but rather time on ice and shorthanded time on ice are, because they're more indicative, because they signal to a larger body of statistics that we can't reference specifically in this tournament, and they also underscore how integral and trusted a player is to their team, which is exactly what Adam Pelech is.
Can I ask? Can I ask you guys a question? And I want to confirm the timer is going to be stopped at these because I won't ask too many if it won't. So you said that really the metric here that's best to be used is time on ice, and I guess I just want to understand, because time on ice really has a lot to do with the other players on a player's team, right? If you have a lot of good players, you have less ice time to go around. If you have poorer players, you don't. And so why should we care about this more than production statistics, which would be put up regardless of the player's time on ice, that we do have in this contest?
Well, that's a great question, Mr. Arbitrator. I would say that for Adam Pelech in particular, his time on ice is certainly not indicative that his teammates aren't strong. As I mentioned previously, his team is an exceptionally strong team, particularly in their defense. And so his time on ice is particularly noteworthy because he's not being put on the ice because everyone else sucks. I mean, they have Ryan Pulock on his team, right? And so for that reason, for that contextual reason, his time on ice, and including his shorthand time on ice, is particularly important.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, if you have no other questions, I'll pass it over to my co-counsel.
Thank you very much to my colleague. So as my colleague mentioned, I'm now going to be going into a more in-depth comparison with our two comparable players, as my colleague mentioned, that is Brandon Carlo and Matt Grzelcyk. So I'm first going to be discussing Matt Grzelcyk in more detail. So as my colleague mentioned, Mr. Grzelcyk is an offensive defenseman. That means he has more power play time on ice than, for example, Mr. Pelech. So Mr. Grzelcyk has about 1 minute time on power play time on ice in his platform year, whereas Mr. Pelech is usually in the low seconds region for his power play time on ice. His platform year was in 2019-20 before COVID, and he's earning an annual average value of 3.7 million. So we would argue that Mr. Pelech should be paid more than Mr. Grzelcyk because he does offer more to his team than we believe Mr. Grzelcyk offers. So we'd first like to take a look at Mr. Grzelcyk's defensive statistics. So these two players are fairly similar in terms of their hits, blocks, and takes, with Grzelcyk slightly outperforming Pelech in each category. So if we take a look at the kind of overall, we can see that in Mr. Grzelcyk's platform year, he had 1.07 takes, whereas Mr. Pelech had about, if we look over here, 0.84. So about half lower. Then if we take a look at his blocks, we can see that Mr. Grzelcyk had about 3.27 and Mr. Pelech had about 2.18. No, that's sorry, that was in the year before, 1.30. So again, we can see a little bit of a decrease, but overall, we can see that the two of them are fairly similar in their statistics, especially if we look at them over their career to platform. It is notable, as my colleague mentioned, that Mr. Pelech's platform year was during COVID-19, whereas Mr. Grzelcyk's was the year before. And so Mr. Pelech was under some stresses that Mr. Grzelcyk just didn't have to face during his platform year. We aren't saying that Mr. Grzelcyk's platform year isn't crucial to this arbitration. In fact, we do rely on the fact Mr. Grzelcyk's response and durability during the pandemic as Mr. Pelech's durability during the pandemic as a sign of his value to the New York Islanders. Furthermore, if we take a look at shorthanded time on ice, we can see that Mr. Pelech consistently outperforms Mr. Grzelcyk. Mr. Grzelcyk hit a career time high of shorthanded time of ice of about 1 minute in his platform year, whereas Mr. Pelech, except for one early season, is consistently far above 1 minute in shorthanded time on ice, showing how he's far more important to his team in his defensive position. Furthermore, if we take a look at their overall time on ice, we see a similar trend, with Mr. Grzelcyk having a time on ice that's consistently under 20 minutes, and Mr. Pelech having a time on ice that in his later seasons, specifically 2019-2020 and 2020-2021, about 21 minutes, even during the pandemic. Furthermore, my colleague mentioned that Mr. Grzelcyk is an offensive defenseman. So he does receive more power play time on ice than Mr. Pelech. However, despite that, his offensive statistics aren't really much above Mr. Pelech's. He has about a 0.27 points per games played, whereas Mr. Pelech has a 0.25. And so despite the fact that Mr. Grzelczyk receives more of an opportunity to play more of an offensive role, he just doesn't deliver in that front. Now, moving on to
yeah. If I may just ask a question. So if I look at the stat lines of these players, you know, I know you've categorized you know, Mr. Grzelczyk as being an offensive defenseman and Mr. Pelech as being a defensive defenseman, but to a certain extent, you can kind of see that Grzelczyk just kind of looks like Mr. Pelech plus a little extra. Now, I'll grant you he plays a little bit less ice time and you know, significantly less shorthanded time on ice, but you know, the rest of the board, I think, favors Grzelczyk. So can you just explain to me where the, like, you know, what are your points of emphasis to sort of really say that Mr. Pelech is the superior defender?
Well, firstly, we'd say that Mr. Grzelczyk, although he's similar to Mr. Pelech, does have more power play time on ice, and we can see that he just doesn't deliver in that area. Secondly, we would say that despite the fact that Mr. Grzelczyk is a defender, he just doesn't receive as much shorthanded time on ice as Mr. Pelech, and so he's just not as reliable in those really critical situations. And yeah, that is basically,
okay.
Yeah.
I got you. Thank you.
And so moving on to Mr. Carlo. So Carlo is a defensive defenseman receiving very little power play time on ice. And his platform year was 2021 to 2022. So that's very useful for comparing their respective durability during the COVID-19 pandemic. And furthermore, he has an average annual value of 4.1 million for his salary. And so we'd argue that Pelech should receive a salary above Mr. Grzelczyk's and similar to Mr. Carlo's, which is where we came to our 4.1 million figure. So taking a look at Mr. Carlo's defensive statistics, we can see that his defensive statistics are higher especially when we look at the years leading up to his platform year. However, what we'd really like to draw your attention to is what happened to Mr. Carlo during COVID-19. So we can see that his hits and his takes dramatically decreased, especially his takes. And then especially when we look at his offensive game, we can see that he took a steep drop in points per games played and an even-handed time on ice. And so and in time on ice per games played. So we can see that Mr. Carlo really wasn't able to adapt to that, and his team saw that. His team took him off the ice more. Whereas if we take a look at Mr. Pelech's statistics, his time on ice stayed the same during the pandemic. His shorthand time on ice decreased by about 30 seconds, but it still remained high. Furthermore, his offensive game remained about the same as it always did. He performed the same as he did in 2019, 2018, 2019, mostly. So Mr. Pelech remained consistent, and that consistency can be very important for a team to know what they're getting when they're putting someone on the ice to form a dependable strategy. So we'd argue that because of that, Mr. Pelech brings something into his team that that Brandon Carlo doesn't. So furthermore, if we take a look at his plus minus scores, Mr. Carlo had a particular downward trend here. We understand that plus minus scores can be really dependent on the teams you're going up against and the other people on your team, especially for a defenseman. But we do think it is important to draw your attention to that downwards trend. Furthermore, we would like to note that despite the fact that Mr. Carlo does have higher hits, blocks, and takes, that doesn't necessarily set him that much higher above Mr. Pelech, for the reason that these don't tell us everything about a player's contribution to his team. So especially if we look at the fact that Mr. Carlo has a little bit less experience than Mr. Pelech, and if we look at the overall inconsistency in his scores. So if we can see that his takes kind of go up and then down, same thing for his hits. Again, we see that he's just not as dependable as Mr. Pelech.
Counsel, you have about 15 seconds to wrap up your arguments because your time has elapsed.
Thank you very much. Apologies for that. So in conclusion, as my colleague argued, Mr. Pelech's main strength that he brings to this team is his dependability, is his consistency, is his ability to neutralize difficult defensive situations. And he outperforms Mr. Grzelczyk and performs similarly to Mr. Carlo in that regard.
Thank you, player council.
Garrett, do you have any questions?
Not at this time for the player side.
Okay, so then I'm going to ask one last one. I'm going to be
Sounds
the hard
good.
ass. Apologies. So, I understand you were working with a certain group of comparables. So I'm going to head this answer off at the pass. Please don't tell me, oh, well, we just got this group of comparables. How am I to deal with the fact that, we're looking at a 1-year contract award and we have these longer term contracts? How should I factor that in your opinion? Because again, your comparables have contracts. I think it's, if I look, it's a 4-year for Grzelczyk and a 6-year for Carlo.
So when you're looking at a longer term contract, a player might settle for a lower salary than what they would have otherwise gone for. So for example, Mr. Grzelczyk might have gone for a $4 million salary if it had been a shorter term contract, but he gets a dependability from having that longer term. And so what that means for Mr. Pelech's salary is really, if you find that these players are comparable, then that just really emphasizes that Pelech should have an even higher salary than what their written down average values are.
Understood. Thank you.
Club side, whenever you're ready, you may begin.
I'd like to preface this by saying we split it up 7 minutes, 7 minutes. So that's how that's going to work.
Yep, go on.
Thank you and good afternoon, arbitrators. My name is Annie Wu, and along with my co-counsel, Joanna Dong, we represent the New York Islanders. In this arbitration between Mr. Pelech and the New York Islanders, given the 3 submissions that will be brought up, we submit a salary request of a 1-year contract valued at $3.8 million. I will give our first submission on how Mr. Pelech made large demands, but his stats don't back it up. And to prove this, I'll be focusing on Pelech's performance in his platform year, blocks, and takeaways. My partner will then bring forth 2 submissions, the first an industry precedent, where blocks and takeaways were clearly valued more than time on ice, and the second being that Mr. Pelech's ability is on the decline. Now, I'd like to start this off with this arbitration being about awarding a contract value to Pelech that he deserves on both an industry and comparative level to his team. Now, our offer already includes a bonus reward to him for being good relative to his teammates. However, it would be unreasonable to pay him much more than the players who are objectively better than him, as well as, or even the same as players who are objectively better than him and the same comparative value to him. Now, he is an objectively good player, but that doesn't mean he should be paid as much as players who are clearly much better on an absolute defensive metrics. What are those defensive metrics? Well, onto our first submission, on how Pelech's defensive stats are just not backing up his demands. So he is a defensive defenseman, and the purpose of the defensive defenseman is to prevent the opposing team from scoring. The most relevant statistics to measure this are blocks and takeaways. Blocks are important because they literally directly measure how many shots the player stopped from entering the goal after the opponent attempted to score. Takeaways are also important because they represent the number of times the player took away the puck from an opponent. This is relevant because opposing players can only score if they have a puck, so when defensemen take away the puck often, that means the opponents don't have the puck and they are not even able to attempt to score. While they do not encompass everything that goes on, they are still very valuable and the only objective statistics that we have that completely show the work of an individual player. Now, for some comparable players, we are going to be using Grzelczyk. My partner will address Carlo, so we agree that these are good players to be comparing to. Now, we were specifically using Grzelczyk to emphasize that he has less time on ice than Pelech. However, he has more to show for it, and that will be addressed again later in my speech. However, comparatively, Grzelczyk has much more blocks and takes than Pelech, as we see that in his platform year at least, Pelech makes less than half the blocks and less than half the takeaways as Grzelczyk. Now, Pelech is a good player, however, if he were on the ice and if Grzelczyk was on the ice, Grzelczyk would be blocking twice as many shots and taking away the puck twice as often. And in that case, we believe that he has more industry value. However, on the comparative value, we admit he has a bit less time on ice. However, we would submit that he has much more time on the power play, which is very helpful to his team and is thus tiring him out so that he cannot be used on the shorthand. This does not mean he is a bad defensive player. Rather, we see with his defensive statistics, he is clearly just as good or maybe slightly slightly less than Pelech on the defensive, and he also has a strong comparative value to his team. However, if you believe he has a bit less comparative value, we somewhat agree with you, which is why we give Pelech a bit better of a salary than Grzelcyk. Grzelcyk's salary is 3.6875 million, whereas our offer is 3.8 million, a good 130,000 more than him because of that comparative value that we admit does exist here potentially. Now, also, this contract lasts for 4 years, which means that his annual average value is already higher than what it would be if he had only signed for 1 year. The reasoning for this is because in this industry, it is much more often seen that the longer a contract is, the longer a player is locked with the team. This means that this player loses out on potentially very lucrative opportunities because they are not able to have competition year after year. They're not able to have other teams all battling each other to give him the best offer, and in that sense, they lose out on a lot of potential money. And because of this, they're going to be given some compensation by their team, and that's why they're offered a bit more money. So in both these ways, Grzelcyk having a longer contract of 4 years, as well as having better defensive statistics, potentially slightly less lower comparative value, that is why we decided on Pelech being slightly more, $130,000 more, and that's how we ended up on our proposal of 3.8 million. Moving on to other metrics we could be using, another metric that could be used to decide on the value that he should be given is time on ice. However, we believe that the defensive statistics are more important to this because time on ice is important only in a relativistic sense compared to the other teammates that are on the team. It is not useful when trying to make a comparison across people in different teams across the general industry. What time on ice really means is that the coach trusted them. And we do have faith in our coaches, and we do believe that their opinions matter. But just because their opinions matter does not mean that their opinion is the only thing that matters. We value our coaches' opinions. However, that doesn't mean that our opinion now that we come to here, while we have all the statistics in front of us, after we have the full picture from the entire season's average, when we are not in the heat of the moment, which our coaches are in, we are also able to come up with a very important analysis of the facts and of the full statistics that we now have, which is why we are valuing our coach's opinion, but it is not the be-all and end-all, and it should not be the only determining factor you use when deciding on your salary, because there are many other statistics and there are many other numbers and values we are given in this competition that are not being addressed. But rather than, again, time on ice, I'd like to note, is not in the direct control of the player whatsoever. What they do have control over is their blocks, hits, takes, points. These are all in their personal responsibility. The time on ice is completely determined by the coach, as well as the state of the teammates and potential other factors. And to say that this time on ice only came from the player being very good or very valued is simply not true. And it is more just a judgment, a subjective judgment by the coach, and it should be given limited value. What is better and what was more objective and absolute is the defensive stats of hits, blocks, and takeaways.
Counsel, how would you respond to a potential argument that given the higher time on ice for Adam Pelech as opposed to some of the comps that you were able to choose from, the fact that perhaps Adam Pelech, when he's on the ice, actually puts himself in such a good position that hits, blocks, and takes are not necessary, and that contributes to his lower number, in the sense that he is in such good defensive position that there are no blocks necessary because, for example, with a block, it requires the opposing team to take a shot, and maybe the opposing team simply doesn't have the puck.
May I have a brief indulgence to answer that question?
Absolutely. And just to make that clear, my question is directed towards why we should adopt your approach of simply choosing hits, blocks, and takes and minimizing the relevance of time on ice as you've advocated.
The reason for this is because, again, time on ice, while it is possible he could be positioning himself well, we don't believe that those positioning himself is able to make up for or able to completely prevent many shots or attempts to break away. Because, again, this is a player who is just one player, and especially on the shorthand time on ice where he is on the ice very often, it's highly unlikely that the other team is never or unable to get the puck very often. Because hockey is a team where, again, many times the puck is going back and forth. This is somewhat inevitable no matter how good a player is, and we think that his blocks and takes are not low because he is not as good in this area, because the other team doesn't have an opportunity. We think that rather this is because the coaches have had a lot of faith in him, possibly because he had very good defensive statistics the year before, but now that faith has been shown to be a bit worse, or at least a bit less valuable or less deserving than they thought it was. Now, to conclude, clearly Pelech has had an underwhelming platform year as a defensive defenseman. However, he didn't just underperform in this platform year. He's had a career that, when you look at the numbers, show that his demands are not being supported by the results that matter most, and that he is on the decline, which my partner will now explain. They will also explain an industry precedent where the defensive stats that I listed are valued more than time on ice. So you don't just have to take my word on it, you can see a precedent. Fundamentally, the absolute results such as blocks and takes in this hockey industry should be strongly valued and considered. And for these reasons, we request he be given a 1-year salary of $3.8 million. Thank you.
Thanks. Before we move on to the next submission, I just have a quick question for you. So, I mean, very, very nice arguments, but if I take you at face value, what you're kind of saying to me is, look, let's look at hits, blocks, and takeaways. We have a better player than Pelech on these metrics, and he's taken a longer-term contract, which has inflated his AAV. So why are you giving him why are you giving Pelech a higher award? Why are you saying he should be making more than Grizzly?
Because we believe that there is still some value in the time on ice, and that is why we give him slightly above on the 100,000, 30,000. But again, it's not the only metric, and we think that ours are actually much more reliable and are the main ones. And you shouldn't just go off of time on ice, which is what our friends seem to propose with their value.
I don't expect you to respond. I'm just noting that there is a bit of an inconsistency here. I'm not disputing the quality or validity of your points. But if we're going to take, the stats, and I know your partner is now going to go hammer home on this further, that these are the important stats, and he's outperforming, it just comes off a little strange to me that we're giving him a higher salary, nonetheless. But I take your point, so I appreciate it. Thank you. No further questions for me.
Co-counsel, whenever you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you, arbitrators. So as my co-counsel mentioned, my name is Joanna Dong, and I will be submitting our last two submissions, the first of which is an industry precedent showing us the value and emphasis put on blocks and takeaways for defensive defensemen, and then a last submission evaluating Mr. Pelech's performance across his platform to career to platform years. So the industry precedent is a comparison between two players that are given to us in this comparable players pool, and that is Josh Morrissey and Issa Lindell. Josh Morrissey has a $6.25 million contract, and Issa Lindell has a $5.8 million contract. And the reason why we're using both of them is, first of all, they have very similar contract terms. It's a 8 and a 6 year contract. In this industry, those are both considered very long contracts, and so we see that the length of the contract would not have a major difference in the salary that they're offered, and also the fact that these two players are both pretty well-rounded. While they do show offensive capabilities, they are valued as defensive defensemen, as can be shown by their long periods on shorthand time on ice, and this is true for both of them. If we take a look at these two players, Morrissey actually has a lower time across all of his time on ice statistics. He has 2 less time for his general time on ice, 3 less for even, and 1 less for shorthand time on ice. And the only area in which Morrissey actually surpasses Lindell is through the miscellaneous and defensive statistics, particularly the blocks, where averagely Mr. Lindell has 5.7 blocks and Morrissey has 5.92 blocks. And that is to say that Mr. Morrissey has 102% more blocks compared to Mr. Lindell. Furthermore, Mr. Morrissey also has higher takes. He has 1.49 takes compared to Lindell's 0.9 takes, and that means 165% more takes compared to Mr. Lindell. And so we can see that even though Mr. Morrissey is put on ice less and therefore arguably valued less by his team, less dependent on, he's still offered $450,000 more because that emphasis is put on his value that he brings to the table with his defensive statistics, where he has higher blocks. He has 102% better blocks and 165% better takes. And applying this to Mr. Adam Pelech, it shows us that there's a great deal of value and emphasis put on this defensive capabilities and statistics on a defenseman. And so if we look specifically at the then defensive statistics across Mr. Pelech's career to platform year, Mr. Pelech seems to have peaked in the 2019-2020 season, where he was able to make the most hits, blocks, takes, and also spent the longest time on ice. And note that the platform year, the year right after, which is the year that we consider most heavily since it's the most recent and most relevant year that is given to a team when considering a contract, he has fallen drastically. There's a 59% decrease in his blocks, a 53% decrease in his take. And while the argument could be made that it was because of the pandemic, which was a major stress factor and took a lot of toll on all the players, note that Mr. Pelech is the only player in our pool who actually went down in all three defensive categories. Other players may have gone down in one or two, but not all three: blocks, hits, and takes. Furthermore, in fact, we can see there has already been an erratic and declining trend that can be seen in Mr. Pelech's record even before his platform year. And I'd like to turn your attention specifically to the blocks, where he has shown a rather erratic trend of it going higher, and then it falls lower, and then it rises slightly, and it falls even lower comparatively to 2 years before. And to illustrate this, he starts with 1.78 in his blocks, it falls to 1.55, it rises to 1.82, and then it falls lower to 1.49. And this is an erratic trend that we can see in Mr. Pelech's own record, which suggests that he is not, in fact, consistently playing each game, and that he's still being thrown off by how well the opposing team plays and the different factors that can arise in different games. Now, I want to go on to a few industry comparisons, and I'll be tackling the Brandon Carlo's comparison. So, Carlo is, again, a 25-year-old player working through a 6-year contract worth $4.1 million, and this was signed very recently, and we can see that Mr. Carlo is also a very defensive defenseman, given his long shorthand time on ice. Objectively, Mr. Pelech makes less than 30% of Mr. Carlo's blocks and less than 60% of the takeaways. And that means if you have Carlo and Pelech on ice, Carlo is stopping more than 3 times as many pucks. And that makes a huge difference since hockey is a relatively low point sport. And so even if you have a difference of, if you're able to stop just 1 puck and stop 1 goal per game, that makes a huge difference in the teams played and in the game overall. Furthermore, if we look at—
Counsel, if I could jump in here with a question. In hockey, no doubt the individual contributions as recorded by hits, blocks, and takes are important, as you have suggested. I would suggest that perhaps another factor that is important is availability for the games. And so to that end, how do you reconcile the fact that Brandon Carlo in his platform year played 27 games in, I believe, a 56-game season, whereas for Pelech, he played every single game of his platform year, which means that he was actually available contributing to his team. And to that end, Brandon Carlo's numbers perhaps are inflated as a result of only having played 27 games in his platform year, where if you think about the fact that if a player plays 1 game and records 8 blocks, their season average per games played for that season would be 8 blocks per game.
Well, there is a possibility that his hits and blocks may be inflated because of that availability issue. Even if we take a look at his past record where he was playing 67 games, he still shows, if not a higher record of hits, blocks, and takes. And so this inflation, I think, we submit is not a huge sort of factor in how well he plays his games, and because he's able to consistently play each game no matter his availability times, as seen in his past records, something that Mr. Pelech is not as good as.
Yeah, that is a good response.
I'll quickly conclude now.
Sorry.
Because Mr. Pelech.
Sorry, I might have frozen there. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you can hear you.
Perfect. Just as a follow-up, I think that's a good response to whether or not the numbers are inflated. I would like to get a direct response on the availability issue where Carlo played 27 games in his platform year and Pelech played every single game. So is there an argument there to be made that Pelech deserves a higher salary than Carlo because Pelech has been durable for the bulk of it, including the platform season?
There is an argument to be made that Mr. Pelech may be deserving of a slightly more monetary value, but we don't think that would surpass Mr. Carlo's salary, because even if Mr. Pelech is available and has great availability times, he does not objectively compare to other players in this industry in terms of his defensive skills. So you could have him on all of the games on every single season, but if his defensive skill doesn't compare to other industry players in this industry, then Mr. Pelech simply would not have the same amount of value in terms of skills and defensive value to that team. So my partner has mentioned that our proposed salary of $3.8 million does account for both his skills value that he brings to his team, but we also give an additional $150,000 more than Mr. Grzelcyk to account for that value that Mr. Pelech poses to the New York Islanders that may not be seen through this numerical data and chart. And we think that because of that, that he objectively is not a better defenseman than Mr. Carlo, who is a $4.1 million player. He should not be receiving a $4 million contract, and our proposed contract of $3.8 million is both reasonable and accounts for all of this value that may not be shown in the chart. Barring any further questions, I will.
Thank you. Yeah, go on.
Yep. I have nothing else. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions for you guys. So first of all, your case study that you did is one of the most creative arguments I've seen in one of these hockey arbitrations. Really interesting. But I do have to ask, because again, you're going to bring a creative argument. You kind of have to be willing to back it up. So you said, well, we have two very comparable players, and the only real differentiator between the two of them are the takeaways and the blocks, which is how we're arguing that takeaways and blocks are kind of, worth whatever the difference is, I guess $450,000 per year. But I got to tell you, I do see some other differences. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Morrissey in his platform year was a significantly stronger offensive defenseman on a per game basis, which again, when we're talking about a $450K difference, which I know this is something like maybe 10% or less of the salary, I could see that making up the difference, as well as the fact that he, in his career, and Grant, he seems to be a bit more of a physical player. So is the idea here that this is really all on, and I know we've hammered you guys on this, and I apologize, but I really want to get this clear. Is this really all on the hits and takeaways? Sorry, the blocks and takeaways?
Sorry, Mr. Arbitrator. So to clarify, you're asking whether there is a value put on Mr. Morrissey's offensive capabilities?
Well, I guess I'm asking if you accounted for that, because again, we're talking about a very small difference in contract. I'm not even going to get to the difference in contract length, which is a separate question. But I can see a relevant difference, and I'm wondering, is for a defenseman, that offensive difference relevant to you?
Well, the difference of $450,000 between these two contracts is certainly the value of Mr. Morrissey's offensive capabilities played into it. If we actually compare their two offensive capabilities, over the record and from their career to platform years, Mr. Lindell actually poses to be a more capable and offensive player, and yet he receives a lower salary, meaning that, well, Mr. Morrissey may have some value added to his platform year offensive capabilities. There isn't much, and most of the value would lie still on his hits and blocks, since that's where the considerable difference lies between these two players. Does that answer your question?
I'm struggling to see how Lindell is the objectively stronger offensive player, given that Morrissey seemed to match his offensive output in significantly less games, which you can see on his points per game played. But I'm not going to push you farther on this. This is sort of a point on top of a point, so I'm not going to push too hard. So that's okay.
Good. So Ben, no other questions for the club side?
Yeah, I think we're okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you both sides for your opening remarks. Player side, you now have 3 minutes to go through your rebuttals.
All right, thank you, Mr. Arbitrators. We'll be splitting this up between us two, as I'm sure you've seen before. Just very briefly, I would like to, even though it was a point on a point, I would say that I think it's crucial to their argument. What they're trying to argue, our friends, is that there is both a precedent, like a precedent within the industry to value hits, blocks, and takes over it. And then because of that, we can look at the comparables and put value. So I would say it is actually quite a crucial point. And it's worth stating that, as you mentioned, it is a little bit overstated in its conclusion, considering that those weren't the only differences between the two comparables that they used to form that precedent. And then, of course, one comparison between two players also is not quite sufficient to set a compelling foundation precedent. So with that taken, just looking at their argument that time on ice is subjective, the coaches aren't necessarily the judge, jury, and executioner of this arbitration. We would note, however, that the coaches in this case do have access to a wider amount of information than we do in this simplified case. And so while that's certainly true in arbitration in general, the coaches aren't going to come in and make the arguments for the lawyers. Time on ice is particularly important in this arbitration and this tournament. And with that, I'll pass it over to my co-counsel.
Just to add on to what my colleague was noting about their argument that using a comparison between these two specific players, we can draw a conclusion about industry precedent, about blocks and takes being more valued. Just to build on that, we don't have the full information about what exactly was considered in that arbitration. We don't know if they only looked at these specific defensive statistics and these specific offensive statistics. They potentially had far more information in front of them. And so we can't speculate as to why one of these players received a higher salary than the other, and we really can't ascribe it to two statistics in particular. And so as such, it's very hard to rely on specifically blocks and takes as predictive defensive statistics. So our friends spoke that when you take these players and put them on the same ice as Pelech in the same game, based on these statistics, they're going to stop the puck twice as much, 3 times as much. But you just can't say that. You can't speculate as to how their performance in those games would compare to Mr. Pelech on the ice at the same time. Those statistics are also relational. For example, Mr. Pelech has a teammate, Mr. Ryan Pulock, who does have particularly high blocks and takes. So Mr. Pelech can rely on Mr. Pulock to potentially provide support in those areas. Furthermore, as you noted, Mr. Arbitrator, Mr. Pelech can avoid the necessity to use those blocks and takes in other ways that is simply not used in these statistics. And with that, we conclude our rebuttal.
Thank you, player counsel. Ben, do you have any follow-up questions?
One, so you mentioned that Mr. Pelech has a teammate that is getting high blocks and takes, so he doesn't have to. Wouldn't that suggest that Mr. Pelech is under a little bit less stress when he's on the ice? In other words, he has an easier job. I don't know if that's necessarily making your point.
I wouldn't suggest that in any way. I would say that potentially these statistics don't describe the full job of a defenseman. So just because those statistics may be slightly eased by Mr. Pelech is in no way stress-free. His job is to fulfill a highly specialized position on his team.
Okay, thank you.
Just to underscore that, when a coach tells a player what to do, they're doing their specialized role. And so what we're trying to say is that there's someone else who's supposed to be doing that role, and that's not Mr. Pelech.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Thank you, player council. Club council, you now have 3 minutes whenever you're ready.
Three things I'd like to address: COVID, and then actually I'll just move on to why we decided on 3.8 million and why specifically that number. So firstly, on COVID, they seem to argue in their submissions that we should disregard the platform year because of COVID-19 and the stresses this brought to everyone. Responses to that are that Pelech went down in all three of his categories: hits, blocks, takeaways, whereas every other player did not seem to drop in such a way that they did not drop in all three of these categories like he did, which is the most drastically. Which somewhat shows that he is a bit less resilient, which you should be able to see is risky for us as the team, because there's no guarantee that after COVID he'll be able to rise up to such a same level, and that shows that in disruptive situations he's not able to keep it up the same defensive stats, which may happen again in the future, disruptive situations. But secondly, I'd like to focus on why we chose 4.1. Okay, so the reason we did this is because because Pelech has worse industry stats than Grzelcyk, but also higher comparative value. So I'd like to readdress the question that the arbitrator asked me about how this might seem a bit contradictory. That's not the case here. The reason we offer Pelech more than Grzelcyk is simply because we want Pelech on our team. We are writing Pelech's contract and not Grzelcyk. We really want Pelech on our team, so yes, we're going to be a bit kinder to him. That's the first response. The second response is because there is higher defensive comparative value that Pelech has compared to Grzelcyk because of that shorthand time on ice. And we acknowledge that he has a bit higher comparative value. So our liking of Pelech and that comparative value in the defensive, which is what our team needs, is why we're giving him a bit higher than that at 130K. However, when we're comparing to Carlo, objectively he has worse industry stats as well as worse on the comparative, because we see on his shorthand time on ice, Carlo has more time there. And you might think, oh, what about the 2 minutes more on the general time on ice? The fact that Pelech has more general time on ice than him. In response to that, the shorthand time on ice is very tiring for these players, and that's why 30 seconds more on the shorthand can very much be why he is too tired to be able to play on the even strength on the general time, which is where that 2 minutes is made through. We don't believe Carlo has any less comparative value, and he also is boosted by the fact that he has those objective absolute metrics we can guarantee mean that he has better industry evaluations or value, which is why he absolutely deserves more than Pelech. Barring any further questions, I'll move on to a conclusion. Complex sports require complex analysis, and the 3.8 million is already a result of that complex analysis, taking into account time on ice, shorthand time on ice, blocks, and takes. Because it's not just about how long he spends on the ice, but we need to consider what he does with that time. We needed to look at the numbers that we all have now. Furthermore, we totally agree that Pelech is valuable, which is why we want him to play with us, but when it comes down to it, something as ambiguous or imprecise as just time on ice should not be the only determining factor that our friends hope that you are convinced that it is. And for those reasons, we respectfully request that arbitrators rule in favor of our 3.8 million proposal.
Thank you, Club Council. I have a question before I toss it over to Ben. I take your point on the possibility that Brandon Carlo, having played 30 seconds more than Adam Pelech, could be a reason why Carlo has a couple of minutes of normal time on ice fewer than Adam Pelech. But when we look at Brandon Carlo's past seasons himself, he played more shorthanded time, for example, in 1920, but played 20 and a half minutes in normal time on ice per game. So it seems to suggest that perhaps Brandon Carlo is able to keep up that pace as he's shown in his previous seasons. And so his downward trend in his platform year is not a result of him playing substantial shorthanded time on ice.
While I take your point that it seems he is somewhat on a downward trend here, we don't necessarily think that's unique to Carlo, because if you look at Pelech himself, as my partner mentioned, Pelech is also on a somewhat of a downward trend, because we should, again, both take into consideration the COVID-19 year And again, while it might seem that, he can keep up this pace, again, COVID-19 could potentially have done things and potentially reduce the endurance and things like this that we don't know.
Ben?
I don't have any questions.
Oh, I'd like to address the arbitrator's earlier question on the industry precedent problems. Could you describe to me, between Morrissey and Lindell, which one you believe has higher, offensive ability and their salary?
Technically, I haven't asked you this, but I'm happy to point out what I'm pointing out. So the two things, and this is more for education because I don't really need a response at this time, but nevertheless, if we're going to go to the Josh Morrissey tab, so I believe his platform year was 18-19. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so if you scroll all the way to the end, the final column, it's points per games played. So this means how many points the player scored. It's a rate stat, right? And of course, where you're using rate stats for your hits, blocks, and takes, you haven't multiplied it out. So we understand that rate stats are important. And you can see that his points per game played is 0.53. If we flip over to Lindell, we can see he's never cracked 0.4. So that's a pretty significant difference. And again, I'm sure Garrett and I are going to talk about the precedent that you've tried to bring, because again, I find it to be very creative. We're talking about a very small difference in salary over contracts that go 6 and 8 years. So it's going to be pretty difficult to attribute anything specific to one or the other, especially when you can find differences like that. I think that's kind of where I was going with that point. I don't feel the need for a response right now to it, but I just like to explain that.
Yeah.
As you asked.
We do not need a response, especially given that we're past time. I appreciate it, Annie.
Okay.
We don't need a response to that. As a discussion point to my colleague Ben there, I think that is a great point in terms of Morrissey having the 0.53 and Lindell having the 0.39. I think that's an excellent point. I will say as a counterpoint, Lindell did score 11 goals in his platform season, and if you divide that out as a rate, that's 0.13, whereas Morrissey had a 0.10 goals per game. So that could also account for it, and I see it cutting both ways. But that is a good point. Anyway, so I see that one of the council has had to leave, which is okay. We'll leave the feedback with your co-counsel there. If it's possible for Matt, I think, to send us into a breakout room, Ben and I, to deliberate. We'll be back in several minutes to give you the feedback and announce the winner.
Yeah, for sure. So Garrett, you'll just want to press pause on the recording button at the bottom there.
Sounds good.
Which I'll do right now as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. And I see the club side here. Do we still have any representatives on the player side?
Yes, I am here. I just need to locations.
Absolutely, no worries. Yep. Okay, so if everyone's here, then Ben and I will start giving the feedback. Without a doubt, one of the absolute best arbitrations we've heard in a very, very long time. You've heard Ben's credentials. He's gone through these competitions so many times, and we were both absolutely blown away by how impressive both teams were. It was no fluke that the two teams are here. Absolutely deserve it. Ben?
Okay, so I mean, if you're okay with me giving my rundown generally, yep. I'll go through it. So starting with some things that both teams did really, really well. Again, I really like, the fact you give the structured roadmap of your argument. Garrett told me this is not just, a hockey thing, this is a legal training thing. And again, what you always want to do is you want to make life as easy as possible for the people who are judging, right? So the fact that you give me 1, 2, 3, and I can write down 1, 2, 3, and then see that that's happening, that's great. You always want to do this when you're making an argument in any context. So good job. And again, really good, presentation by both teams. I'm going to start with the player side. So, I mean, just going through it, I think, your contextualization of the player was really, really good. I think you kind of did a very good job of giving the whole picture of why this is an important player to the team. And that's what that portion of the argument is supposed to do. And I think you did it well. In terms of your discussion of comparables now, and now the other team got a little bit of a free pass because you picked them and then they just got to say, we agree. But you know, because of that, I can't go too hard on you guys, and because you were given a set, I'll just reiterate that, you know, if you are to ever do this again, and maybe, you know, if you're doing something similar in a different context, we want something very rigorous. You know, when you're talking about, I like this guy because he's a defensive defenseman, it doesn't mean very much. So usually we want to give statistical underlying reasons. Now, again, I know you can't really do that here, but I just want to put that out for both teams. You want to say, we looked at guys who blocked shots. We looked at guys who played a lot of time. We don't want to just say, we looked at guys who we thought were defensive defensemen. In terms of my questions, I think you guys did a very good job of answering them on the fly. You know, I think that the Grizzly comparable was pretty. They were both good comparables for you guys, and I think the biggest thing I want to just get to you guys is, you know, your pacing was phenomenal. I think that was really, really good. Last thing was, you know, you guys went on the hit, blocks, and takes. Don't tell us everything. I think you guys did as good as you could with both your argument and the rebuttal, is sort of, you know, really focusing on that. And I think that was the right place to focus. So I think that was well done. Moving on to the club side, you know, for me, your big thing was creativity. You were given a rubric and you just smashed it. And fortunately, you did it really, really well. And that's always going to stand out, right? I mean, your structure was to go, you know, argument 1 and then comparable 1 and then argument 2 and then comparable 2. That's non-traditional, but it does give a little bit of a different flavor. And I thought that was good. And it allowed for balance between you two as presenters. You know, I think that and I think Garrett really should be talking about the industry precedent more, so I'm going to skip that, but granted, that was a really creative point. And then in terms of your rebuttal, I thought this was just such an eloquent point. I don't even know if you did this intentionally. But arbitration is done between real people, and the player is going to be sitting in the room, and you are, you know, as the club saying, well, this guy isn't this, isn't that, he doesn't do this, he doesn't do that, and then he's going to come back and play for you for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Like, that's a very difficult balance. And if you read sports, like sports news, you know that players have left teams over really bad arbitration experiences. So I think you did such a nice job flipping my Grizzly question of, you know, why are you giving him a higher salary than a guy you're basically saying is better, into, we have a relationship here. That was one of my favorite things in this arbitration process. So excellent job there. One tiny piece of feedback, 2 tiny pieces of feedback on the other side of this. You know, I think it's really important to speak slowly, and to the extent you can, be a little bit less rehearsed. You know, when you move quickly, it's harder to follow. And that's what we started with. We started with roadmaps, make things easier to follow. And when you want to make a point, you stop. And then people think. And that's those key point-making moments. I felt, because you guys were a little scripted, which again is fine. But I think when you want to make an argument, you have to have that pacing down. It makes everybody's life very easy. My last point is that you have to be careful to not be inconsistent, because you get kind of trapped in your own web when you do that. And so for me, the inconsistency really kicked in when, in your rebuttal, you went for, you know, Adam Pelech, you know, didn't do so well in COVID, and that shows he's not going to handle these high pressure, tough situations. Good argument. But then when you turn around and then you use COVID as an excuse for Carlo, well, then what is it? Is COVID an excuse, or is COVID this tough time you have to push through? So, you know, it's very important to be consistent. And I think that was a dangerous area you got into. But again, fantastic argument. The creativity was off the charts. Garrett was not wrong. The market comp is what you're supposed to do, and nobody does it. So really good.
Thank you, Ben. And I second every single thing that Ben had said. I will add on the industry point. As Ben has mentioned, that is something that is done in real arbitration. It is an absolutely excellent point, because what you are aiming to do in arbitration is to fit the player within the relevant marketplace. That's why we use comparable players. And within that relevant marketplace, there has to be certain factors driving what is worth more. And when you talk about forwards, that's likely goals, assists, points. When we talk about defensemen, it's usually some sort of ice time or some of these miscellaneous stats like hits, blocks, and takes. So trying to look at the list that you're given and trying to explain why one player got higher than another player, and then to use that as a signal of which stats might mean more, is a really important way to define it. I will say on the marketplace argument that traditionally it is done with the comparable players you do choose to form the basis of your arbitration. In this case, for both sides, it was Carlo and Grzelcyk. So where the marketplace argument may falter a little is the fact that you used Morrissey and Lindell to form the marketplace argument. Because the flip side of that is Morrissey and Lindell make significantly more money than what is involved in this arbitration. So even if we take your point that it is the blocks and the takes that form that marketplace and drives why Morrissey got a bit more money than Lindell, it could also be argued that that drives the top end defensive market, the defenseman for Morrissey and Lindell, but has no implications on the lower end, which both sides have argued are Pelech and Carlo and Grzelcyk. So being aware that you should be using the comps, the ones that are relevant to this arbitration, to drive the marketplace argument is the step that you can take to improve further your arguments. Very quickly rattling off some of the feedback I have, and I'm going to skip over the ones that Ben have mentioned because Ben was very eloquent in delivering those. For the player side, I think that you very much explained the specialized defenseman argument. I think within the constrained comparable players that you had, you definitely would eventually have to run into some who are more offensive than defensive. So making sure that you weren't choosing ones who were two-way was important, and a really good job in explaining that. I thought the answering of both Ben and I, the questions that we asked was off the charts. It was one of the highlights of this arbitration, and for both sides, I think the way you handled those questions was brilliant. My big piece of advice for the player side is, based on the comps that you chose, especially with the Carlo comp, I felt that the player side should have requested higher. I think there is a clear argument to be made here that, at least on the player side, Pelech is better, if not significantly better, than Brandon Carlo. And my question was very much highlighting that. Carlo's trend goes downward significantly. He plays half a season in his platform year. And so for the player side to advocate for a salary equal to what Brandon Carlo made seems to be requesting a little too low. And I think as the client, if I were Adam Pelech, I would be a little upset that even if you got 100% of your request, it would only be 4.1. And when I look across the teams, I see, Brandon Carlo and the stats that he got given his contributions in his platform year, I'd be a little bit questioning why that was the number that I got. So I think definitely you don't want to be way too aggressive, but you want to be able to advocate for the best interest of your clients, not just a number that you can get for sure. So being aware of that is important. And flipping over to the club side, I thought you made really, really good concessions to evaluate Grzelcyk versus Pelech. To Ben's point, your acceptance of the evaluation between Grzelcyk and Pelech and based on your working relationship was brilliant. And I thought the conclusion, especially in the rebuttal, when you kind of had the punchy line there, and then you drove home the fact that, we're using a complex calculation here to get to our number, and this is what this arbitration should be. I thought that was really good. But I do second Ben's point about the inconsistency. I also flagged the COVID point as well. To use that as a double-edged sword seems a little inconsistent. But I do feel like the salary number that you came in with, the 3.8, was a very reasonable number for the club side, taking into account the statistics as well as the relationship you have with the players. So both sides did incredibly, incredibly well, and so many things to build off of going forward. So I think everyone has a future in law and in sports law. keep it up, and you'll be miles ahead of Ben and I at this point. So great work. All right, so if there are no other comments, and I don't have any, and Ben, if you're good to go, then we will announce the winners of this high school hockey advocacy competition of Canada for the year 2022. And the winner is Team L, the club side. It was an absolute razor thin margin, and Ben and I went back and forth on this. Ultimately, it did come down to the creativity of the argument. Both sides were fantastic in making that assessment. The marketplace argument was really good, and the player came in a little low on the salary request. But ultimately, Ben and I thought both teams on any given day could have won this competition. So congratulations. Yeah, Matt.
No, I just wanted to say congrats to both teams on just a fantastic tournament and a fantastic final here. So, I mean, that concludes the this edition of the Hockey Advocacy Competition at Canada. So I'd just like to say thanks again to Garrett and to Ben and all of the other guest arbitrators who were here with us this weekend. I'd also like to say thanks to all the students at Garth Webb Secondary School who worked very hard to put this on. And again, thanks to all of the competitors. This was a really wonderful event for especially the first time that we're running it. And we've just been so pleased, and, you know, we're just so impressed with all of you. So, you know, thanks so much for being here with us. And I guess with that in mind, I'll turn off the recording. So I'll